Hey there, folks. Let's talk a little bit about political participation, traditional political participation. In this set of slides, this is going to be, in addition to the suggestions that you've made in terms of different pieces to encourage political participation. So let's dive in and we'll talk a little bit about each one of them.
I hope you've been able to understand that participation in American politics is not just limited to voting at the ballot box. It's so much more than just the simple act of filling out your ballot and putting it in the ballot box or submitting an electronic ballot. It ranges from that, the very easy version of political participation, to starting your own interest group. And anywhere along the way in the spectrum, we're talking about political participation. So let's make sure we have a full definition to start. Political participation really is all the activities that are used by citizens to influence the selection of the leaders and the policies they pursue. See, that's the key thing. A lot of times people think political participation is simply voting for people or voting people out, but the real influence comes when we talk about the public policies that they're making. Sometimes we fall woefully short of that version of political participation, and the interest groups are really good at that kind of political participation, which gives them a whole lot more power than the average Joe or Jane citizen has in our system. So when we look at those examples, we're talking about conventional participation. Conventional is voting in elections. There's nothing controversial about it. Working in the campaigns or running for office even, that's what we would call conventional. Contacting the elected officials, something I know a little bit about, but it's something that is very conventional and it's traditional. Maybe it isn't the most effective, but it is definitely traditional types of political participation. And they do have their value and they do have their place, absolutely, as linkage institutions in our democracy. There are some forms of political participation that make people uncomfortable. And that's in fact what they're designed to do, is to make people uncomfortable. When we're talking about this kind of political participation, we're really talking about unconventional political participation. We're talking about protests, we're talking about sit-ins, we're talking about boycotts, we're talking about all kinds of different examples of non-traditional, unconventional political participation. The civil rights movement is an absolutely wonderful example of both conventional political participation, that which didn't work and that which didn't actually create changes in public policy for African Americans and those who supported African American civil rights. And rather than the approach turned to unconventional political participation. And that was one of its most effective, powerful tools, I think, in making it successful. So when we talk about protests, we're really talking about that kind of participation that's designed to achieve the policy changes through dramatic or unconventional tactics. One of the great examples of this is civil disobedience. And it doesn't have to just be liberals that are conducting civil disobedience. People often make that misconception in their mind. Conservatives use civil disobedience all the time, and it's just less obvious. The perfect example of conservatives using civil disobedience to stand up for their rights and to affect policy change was the county clerk in Kentucky who refused to distribute, sign, and authorize marriage licenses for same-sex couples. Kim Davis is a great example of civil disobedience. She went to jail on purpose, knowing she was breaking the law, because she wanted to stand up and bring light to an unjust law. The people that believe that these laws are immoral and willing to suffer the consequences, be that jail, be that physical consequences, they're conducting what we call civil disobedience. At the end of this, I'm going to ask you to watch two videos. one talking about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the other highlighting a woman, Alice Paul, during the women's suffrage movement. Both of these are wonderful examples of people and organizations that are trying to affect the political process through unconventional means or through protest, both of which worked quite well. And they're shining examples of the power of protest as participation.
When we look at how Americans participate in politics, we can look at these different quartiles, and we can look at the very low income, middle income voters, and very high income voters, and you can see that as we trend up, as the income level goes up, our level of participation also increases. The red line looks at attending political meetings and rallies. The blue line looks at giving money to a party candidate, and the green line looks at trying to influence voters. You know, if we're looking at it, if you're in any of these areas here, your voice is much more heard than, you know, if you are in these low or very low income levels. And that speaks to an issue that we have in our political process. This set of data looks at a comparison of conventional activity versus questionably. You can look at petitions, boycotts, and demonstrations, and you can see that many more people are willing to participate in, you know, clearly conventional activity, whereas we might do these boycotts or demonstrations, but not necessarily quickly, you know, able to participate or. You know, this is a great slide that looks at where we are compared to other nations. You know, compared to these 8 other nations, Americans are noticeably apathetic when it comes to politics. You can look and see that over half of American respondents report that they voted in the last election, they signed a petition or were interested in politics. But we're less likely than respondents in other countries to join demonstrations. And if we look at this research, we've only begun to see what the level of internet participation might look like. But in the United States, only about 7% of respondents really claim to have discussed politics on the internet as of the time of this polling. And it's right now perhaps an infrequent political participation method. You can see here that, you know, when we're comparing our level of interest in politics to other countries versus, you know, joining demonstrations and boycotting, we don't perform as well in these demonstration pieces, but we're willing to boycott. It's an easy individual thing for somebody to do and participate. What I think is important about this slide and this data that we look at, it looks at voter registrations in the South from 1960, 1980, and 2000. And you can see there is a huge difference because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and other things that were happening on the national level. And black voter registration in the 11 states of the old Confederacy doubles basically between 1960 and 1980. And in 2000, really, we see very little difference. And you know, we're at that 64% threshold, but as compared to whites, that gap is closing, and that's been through the intentional efforts of policies and policy actions by government. You know, what I love about this slide is you can look at the various levels or the various pieces of political participation. Initiative, referendum, and recall are very much things that give people democratic power within the system. And you can see where those exist. And you can see that as we move westward, we started to give people more power, and this populism really took root, as compared to in the old school East Coast, Eastern Seaboard, you know, in the colonies, where traditional forms of democratic participation didn't trust the people. As we move west, we see a lot more trust in the people. This is when I start to get a little bit depressed, if you will, because compared with the turnout rates in these 16 established European nations, you see voter turnout for American presidential elections ranks below all but 3 of the countries. You know, so if we look at where we are, you know, we are essentially right in here in between the United Kingdom and Luxembourg. But when you look at our participation in congressional elections, it's lower than everybody else's. And we make a determination as Americans that apparently the presidential election is more important, and in fact it's not. But what I challenge us to think about is, how do we get up into that top tier in terms of Sweden, Denmark, and Belgium, where they have 80 plus to 90+% participation. We have a long way to go. We talked about this in class a lot. Your likelihood of voting in the election, discussing politics, talking with people about voting steadily increases with the more education you get. Education is a great liberator, but education is also a mark of your level of political participation. The more education you get, the more you start to realize that it's an important part of the process. So we as high school teachers have to realize that conversation needs to be happening a lot sooner and a lot more frequently, because just with a high school only education, we're not getting ourselves the political participation that we could get the more education we see. If we take a look at this is an unsolved puzzle, and the decline of voter turnout really is predicted by sort of almost a very depressing trend. Education typically strongly predicts the likelihood of voting in the United States, and if we look, as the percentage of adult citizens with a high school education or more has grown steadily since the end of World War II, the overall rate of voter turnout trended downward from 1960 to 1996, and it's still below levels 2 decades after the war. Why this turnout has decreased as education increases is really an unsolved puzzle, and we need to figure that out to increase that participation. If we look at it this way, this is an important graph because it looks at our voter turnout in terms of age. If you're an 18 to 24-year-old citizen versus an 18 to 29-year-old citizen, 25 years and older citizen, and you look at our voting trends, this really blocks it out into both presidential. So if you're looking at this data up here, it's presidential, and then if you're looking at this data here, you're looking at congressional voting participation, and it's it's an important group that we need to consider as we look at our voter turnout numbers. All of this points to a question of how effective our democracy is, and we measure our effectiveness in a democracy based on how a citizen can affect policy decisions in the institutions of government. Traditionally, we say meeting with public officials, supporting candidates, and voting elections are the typical ways to do that. But sometimes you have to operate outside of the legal system, people feel, in order to affect the change, because the democratic process isn't working. If and when you have to operate outside the legal system, that's when we start to call this a non-democratic government or a non-democratic form of participation. When you break the law, this borders into that non-democratic function, democratic. So what do I want you to think about here in the end? Really some key questions. How effective is our political participation? What level of efficacy do we feel as voters, and why is that the case? And finally, what changes might we need to make in order to encourage that political participation? Those are the questions I want you to consider.